Hello everyone, I am Frightening Findings, and we are back with more 3 True Scary Reddit stories. And in this one, we have one about Satanists and the occult and some strange shadow figure. Before we get into those stories, make sure to smash that subscribe button and give the like button a frightening experience. Now, let's get into these stories. This happened to me a few months ago, around June of this year. I was planning a road trip to Deadwood, South Dakota, driving there from North Dakota. I was going with my grandparents on my dad's side, along with my cousins and aunts. My mom didn't come with us. On the day of the trip, my mom drove me to my grandparents' house, and everything was normal. Later that day, I was in the back seat of my grandpa's car while my grandma sat in the passenger seat. I had been dealing with a broken phone for a while before the trip. It had lines across the screen. Sometimes it would go dark and wouldn't turn back on for a while. That scared me a bit, but it usually only happened later on during the trip. I had a blanket, a pillow, and another item in the back seat with me. The drive was about 8 to 10 hours, so I slept for at least a third of the trip. Fast forward to when we finally arrived, I had slept around 5 hours on the drive, and we pulled into the garage of this big, luxurious rental house where we were staying for a week. As I got out of the car, I was greeted by my older cousin, who I'll call G. We were both excited to see each other since we had only met once before when I was much younger. G and I shared a room with 2 beds. She had the one closest to the window, and I took the one closest to the TV. Later that night, we hung out in another room with a big bed. The people who stayed there before us hadn't logged out of Disney Plus, so we decided to use it. G told me she was going to rewatch JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, and I joined her. We started from the very beginning. That's how I became a big JoJo fan. I've since watched all the currently animated parts: Phantom Blood, Battle Tendency, Stardust Crusaders, Diamond is Unbreakable, Golden Wind, and Stone Ocean. Anyway, we got through the middle of Phantom Blood before I fell asleep. Everything was still normal at that point. A couple of days later, G, my other cousin, let's call her O, and some of my little cousins from Texas were outside near the jacuzzi and small sauna under the balcony. It was midday, and we were playing around, crushing rocks. I was sharpening a stick on the concrete. Don't judge me, it was just kid stuff. At some point, I tossed the stick and wandered away from the group. The rental house was about 100 feet away from the neighboring houses, and these were all very close to the woods, like actual woods. 20 feet away from the balcony, there was no sign of civilization. I walked around to the opposite side of the house, and suddenly, everything went eerily quiet. I couldn't hear my cousins anymore, though I knew they were fine on the other side of the house. I found myself standing between 2 rental houses, staring into the forest. At that moment, I felt something strange. It was like something in the woods was calling me, urging me to keep walking. I took a step forward, and it felt like I was completely alone with the silence and whatever was out there. Suddenly, a powerful sense of dread and fear washed over me. I was frozen in place. Time seemed to slow down, and it felt like only I and whatever was in those woods existed in that moment. I'm not talking about a spirit or a person. This was something different, like a cryptid. Something animalistic, yet almost human. The presence was surreal and terrifying. Eventually, I snapped out of it and slowly backed away from the woods. After that, I stayed far away from that part of the property for the rest of the trip. Later that day, it was just G and me relaxing in the jacuzzi. It was nighttime, and the darkness around us was thick. The only sound was the soft buzz of the jacuzzi. I stared out into the pitch black void of the woods, and that same feeling of dread crept back in, though not as strong as before. I brushed it off, and we spent the rest of the night just sitting there in silence, surrounded by the darkness. I never mentioned either experience to anyone, not even G. You're the first person I've told about what happened during my trip to the outskirts of Deadwood, South Dakota. Since then, I haven't had another experience like that. And if you're wondering if this is fake, I promise you, it's not. Years ago, I used to do yard work for my aunt while I was pregnant and between jobs. At the time, she was helping out an older couple in their 50s who had fallen on hard times, William and Jenny. They were staying at my aunt's house while trying to get back on their feet. In exchange for their room, William helped out by doing repairs around the house. One day, while I was working in the yard, I noticed William standing outside, staring at the road. He was a quiet guy, kind, but not someone who talked much. However, he looked troubled that day, so I asked him if he was alright. "Yes, well, I guess," he replied. I've always tried to be empathetic towards others, even if I don't know them well. So, I told him that if something was bothering him, or if he just needed to talk, I was happy to listen. "Well," he started, pulling a cigarette case out of his pocket. He snapped open his Zippo lighter and took a long drag from the cigarette. Until that moment, I haven't even noticed he smoked. He began telling me about the place he and Jenny had been staying before they moved into my aunt's house. They had a small, broken-down RV that still ran, and they would drive it to different places and park for the night. One night, they parked in a run-down part of town, about 30 minutes away from my aunt's house, near some old train tracks. It was late at night, after dark. As soon as they parked, William was overwhelmed by an intense sense of anxiety, doom, and fear, something he couldn't fully describe. Although he wasn't a believer in the paranormal at the time, he said he absolutely sensed something was wrong. "It didn't feel like a human presence," he told me. "It felt like evil was sharing space with us." They had a small dog, and Jenny, who didn't seem to feel the same fear William did, took the dog outside to go to the bathroom. William stayed inside the RV alone when, suddenly, the door swung open on its own. He called for Jenny, but she didn't answer. That's when he felt an icy chill sweep through the RV, and he heard something. It was like heavy breathing, almost a low, snarling sound. He didn't see anything. He could feel heavy footsteps rushing toward him, and then he felt something go through him. His entire body went ice cold. He could smell sulfur in the air, and he was paralyzed for a few moments. When he could move again, he fell but quickly scrambled to his feet and rushed out of the RV, frantically searching for Jenny. He called her name, but she didn't respond. Eventually, she appeared, out of breath. She told him that the dog had run off as soon as she took him outside. When she found him, he was shaking and terrified, more scared than she had ever seen him before. They packed up the things and left immediately. Whatever had been in that area, William believed it was something demonic, something that wanted to harm him. It took him months to tell Jenny what had happened in the RV that night when she was outside with the dog. As William recounted this story to me, he was visibly shaken. For such a quiet man, it was clear how much this experience had affected him. He told me that he would still get flashbacks of that presence moving through him, the ice-cold chill, the overwhelming fear, and the feeling of paralysis. Whatever it wasn't human, and it had wanted to harm him. I've never felt anything like that, he muttered under his breath, lighting another cigarette. This happened over 10 years ago, and even though I'm no professional storyteller, listening to him describe that night has stuck with me ever since. I've always wondered what was really out there by those old, run-down train tracks. I want to share something that happened during my time in Sibiu, Romania. First, a bit of backstory. My ex-girlfriend lives in Sibiu, and we met online about 5 years ago. I'm from the Netherlands, so I would fly over to visit her several times. Every time I was there, she told me a lot about Romania and its strong religious culture. Romania is a deeply religious country, and superstition runs deep, not just among the older generations, but even among young people. On my second visit, I booked a small, cozy apartment on Airbnb. It wasn't too expensive, and the location was great, just a 3-minute walk from the city center, right in the old town. However, the apartment had an eerie vibe. This was before I got into the cult and everything. The strangest part was that the place was filled with mirrors. There were at least 30 of them scattered around. The most bizarre one was a small, round mirror above the bed, surrounded by 100 branches pointing outward. Something else that seemed suspicious was that every Monday, a priest would come to bless the house. It made me wonder if something had happened there. Now, on to the story. We often took long walks around the neighborhood and very close to the apartment, maybe just a street away. There was a huge, abandoned orphanage or kindergarten. My ex told me it had been abandoned for a long time. There was even an old subway entrance nearby that led underground, but the subway hadn't been active in Sibiu for decades. The orphanage was surrounded by a large garden and closed off by tall fences. Being young and reckless, we decided we wanted to explore it, of course. So, we made plans with a cousin and the cousin's boyfriend to sneak in one night around 1 a.m. As the day approached, we made our plans to meet up. But then our cousin sent her a news article. A few years earlier, something had happened in the abandoned building. According to the article, some Satanists had broken in and killed a few cats, using their blood for rituals. I don't know if they were actual Satanists, people interested in the occult, or just kids trying out some ritual they found on YouTube. But either way, the story freaked out my ex and her cousin, and they no longer wanted to go. Naturally, I was disappointed, especially since I'd already developed an interest in the occult. Instead of venturing into the orphanage that evening, we decided to stay inside. We lay on the bed with that creepy mirror above it, watching YouTube on our phones and eating sunflower seeds, a classic Eastern European snack for those who know. Suddenly, my ex gasped and seemed terrified. She was staring at the window. The window wasn't transparent. You couldn't see through it clearly, but you could make out shadows and shapes. I looked over and saw it too. A shadow in the shape of a head. What struck me as odd was that we were several floors up, and there was nothing in the backyard or anywhere near the window that could have cast a shadow like that. Then, the temperature in the room dropped dramatically, and a horrible stench filled the air. We both stared at the shadow as it began to move, slowly, inching away from the window. Just before it disappeared, 2 horns appeared at the top of the shadow, and then it was gone completely. We were paralyzed with fear. I've never felt anything like that in my life. After a few moments, we snapped out of it, hurriedly got dressed, and rushed out to a nearby mall that was still open. We closed the curtains before leaving and never opened them again for the rest of our stay. The next day, we checked outside the window, but we couldn't find anything that could have caused what we saw. No lanterns, no roofs, no cars passing by, no trees, nothing. So that's my story. I'm really curious to hear what y'all think about it, and what you believe it could mean.